اومدید. جاناتان هارناف یک ژورنالیست هستش در نیویورک و کمیونیکیشنز دایرکتور هستش در مؤسسه جینسا The Jewish Institute for National Security of America. یه ژورنالیست هستن ایشون و یه سابقه هم خیلی از نظر ژورنالیست خیلی سابقه دارن با ایران و خاورمیانه و اسرائیل. ما می‌خواستیم دعوتشون کنیم به این برنامه Politics 365 که با توجه به حوادث وحشتناک اکتبر 7 نظر ایشون چیه و بررسی ایشون چیه و موضوعی که ایشون درش ریسرچ کردن ما چه بهره برداری میتونیم بکنیم ازشون. Jonathan Harounoff, welcome to Politics 365. If you could quickly introduce yourself, your background, and then we'll get into your role with JINSA. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on your show, Shahryar. So I'm a British journalist who's been writing about Israel and Iran for the past 7 or so years for a number of international publications. And I also serve as Director of Communications at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, or JINSA, in Washington, D.C. And JINSA is a think tank that's based in Washington, D.C. that's focused on advancing US national security interests in the Middle East and has for decades pursued and advocated for a robust US-Israel security relationship in order to achieve that goal. And I only started in this role at the end of September, just weeks before Hamas's attacks on October 7th and the start of the war that followed. So it's been a very busy month or so for me and for everyone at JINSA. But right from the start, our experts at JINSA have been publishing detailed briefings on the developments in Israel and in Gaza and broader regional ramifications as a result of October 7th, including, for example, how it impacts all the progress that had been made up until that point between Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations, for example, and also on the risks of the conflicts in Israel and Gaza escalating more broadly should groups like Hezbollah get involved from the north. Our experts at JINSA in the US and in Israel, many of them are retired Israeli and US generals. So they have a very unique perspective, and they've shared some of that expertise in different media outlets, including Bloomberg, CNN, Fox News, CNBC, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and more. And Shahryar, on a personal note, I've been deeply impacted by the events going on in the region, not just because I've been covering it as a journalist for so long or because of my personal connections there, but also because I've seen the conflict spill out and transcend borders, and now it's rearing its ugly head in Europe, the US, Canada, in very ugly ways, and especially on college campuses, including my alma maters of Harvard, Columbia, and Cambridge in England.
Thank you for sharing that, and I couldn't agree more. There's no room for anti-Semitism in America, but unfortunately we're always witnessing it at different, most unexpected areas. You would think academic institutions would be a place of inclusion and thoughtfulness and tolerance, but what I've seen is disgusting, and I'm really ashamed that students have to be party to that and witness it and have to fear for their safety in this country in this day and age. Whatever, whether you're Palestinian, Jewish, Black, white, Iranian, to have that experience now in 2023, I just feel like we're 50 or 100 years back in time, which was a stain on humanity as far as I'm concerned, what we've witnessed. Of course, everyone's familiar with the Holocaust, but when we say this was the worst attack since the Holocaust, it really was. It seemed to me it was the Israeli equivalent of 9/11, but so close to home, so personal, so barbaric, I think it shocked the world. And that's why I wanted to reach out to as many different voices on both sides, Palestinian, Israeli, nonpartisan, to hear their points of view, hear their personal stories, how they've been impacted, and how they kind of see it evolve. Now, before we get into kind of your research and analysis and perspectives, if you could, because I'm always a structural person. I like to understand structures. So there's AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and there's I don't know how many other public affairs groups there are that further, Israeli or Jewish public affairs. But you mentioned national security, so there's some overlap between JINSA and AIPAC, or how do these two groups work together?
Uh, Thanks for that, and thanks for everything you said before. Um, APAC and JINSA and other non think tanks in Washington DC operate very, separately and differently. I'm sure there is some overlap because they're both focused on Israel. But JINSA, I can't speak for APAC, but JINSA is non-partisan and it focuses primarily on advancing US national security interests in the Middle East. And it's always striving for, peace in the region. And one of the ways in order to achieve that, JINSA believes, is by advocating for a stronger, more formalized US-Israel security relationship. And it had been something that JINSA had been working on for years, even before October the 7th. But I think what happened on October the 7th brought this to the fore and, highlighted the importance of it.
Right. Thank you for explaining that. And now that you mentioned the kind of the work that JINSA does, it leads me to a historical question, which has come up in pockets of reporting, and I wanted your feedback on it before we get into kind of, again, JINSA's work. I've seen Hamas leaders on Arabic media speak about their logic or justification, which was horrendous, doesn't make any sense to me. But it seemed to me, and I wanted your perspective on it, on these 2 points I'm going to mention. First, it seemed like they were very callous and cavalier with the lives of the Palestinian people. They felt like this attack was justified in their tormented, demented mind. And somehow, that's just the price of freedom. However many people die, that's just what it is. And they cited all these different points in history where liberty, as they called it, Afghans and different liberty, came at the price of the loss of innocent lives. So they were very forthright about their objective. What they didn't mention, and is what I've seen historically, and I've heard lots of different historians talk about this, is all the different times the Palestinian leadership has turned down a two-state solution or some form of accord with Israel. I counted 5, but I don't know if that's the right number. 5 different times where they could have said, let's call this the two-state, so let's share, let's live together, and somehow the leadership has pushed back on it. I just like your perspective and maybe JINSA's view of those 2 points, however which way you like to address it.
Sure. So I'll touch on the first point that you mentioned about the Hamas's callous approach to what happened on October the 7th. I don't think, I know that there was an initial reference to the Holocaust, and I'm very hesitant to ever, invoke the Holocaust. But I think something that's been pointed out is that, when the Nazis perpetrated their attacks on the Jewish people, there were some attempts to disguise what they were doing. There was denial. Whereas here, you're not only seeing a denial or a celebration of what's going on, but they filmed exactly what they were doing throughout the atrocities. They were filming it on GoPros for the world to see, and that's why as a journalist, it's even more concerning to see now, the rapid rise of Jew hatred worldwide. Because these perpetrators film their horrific attacks quite proudly on their GoPros and live stream their massacre on Telegram, Facebook, WhatsApp, and other social media networks. Touching on your point about peace, I think right now Israel's position is that it acknowledges that what happened on October the 7th was a huge military and intelligence failure. Failure for the Israeli people, and the Israeli people are going to demand that there will be a very thorough investigation of how this could have possibly happened, who's responsible, and how to ensure that this never happens again. It was one of the biggest pogroms in human history, and certainly the first pogrom in history to have been broadcast and filmed on the internet for the world to see. In terms of peace, and I think the priority now for Israel is to ensure that it achieves its own objective of eliminating Hamas, and it's got to do that in order to reestablish its deterrence, in the region, and also to ensure that Israelis again feel safe, so that Israelis who had fled the south, to move elsewhere, feel comfortable, moving back into the south. And I don't think that's ever going to happen as long as Hamas remains in power. And I think it would be premature and unwise to just have that as an objective, to just eliminate Hamas, because what comes afterwards. You can't just eliminate Hamas and leave this vacuum there. You've got to be thoughtful about what will come after Hamas, so that there isn't a vacuum that would just leave space for a Hamas 2.0 to emerge. So the real question now, Shahryar, is how do we make sure that the new rulers of Gaza build a life that's in the interest of their own Palestinian people, and that's not hell-bent almost exclusively on the destruction of Israel.
Right. And
yeah, sorry.
No, thank you. I think that's a wise perspective of what we're witnessing was a terrible situation. I mean, I think it's a no-win situation. You have, I think the Israeli communities around Gaza that not only do they have a right to defend themselves, they have a right to live in peace, and so do the people of Palestine, who seems like they're being held hostage by Hamas all these years. I think everyone feels for the Palestinian people, but you're watching this situation unfold, and it's just heart-wrenching to watch so many children being used as human shields in Gaza. But one thing I also watch on general news, and I guess since you mentioned Israel's plan in Gaza or future or hope, every time Israel launches with the sophisticated weapons against, known targets that Hamas is using under hospitals, next to schools, all the different places that we've seen, they have to know it will have collateral damage, being so dense a population. And by the way, I don't expect you to answer for the entirety of the Israeli government. And I think just for the sake of the viewers and listeners, they should know, like any country, there's a massive division within Israel, like any other country. There's a left and a right. There's people that agree with the government. There's people that strongly disagree with the government. So you have all of this diversity. I think Israel is just as diverse in many aspects as American society is, and divided as American society is sometimes. So how, from a security standpoint, as you mentioned, some generals are involved in what you're doing, how do you reconcile the collateral damage of defending yourself?
It's an important question to address. And before I do so, I just want to touch on the previous point that you mentioned about Israeli society being so polarized. And it's an important fact, Shahryar, because it's easy to forget that right before October the 7th had happened, Israeli society had never been so polarized. There was a huge rift between the left and the right, tensions between, ultra religious and secular as well. But all of that, faded and disappeared after the attacks of October the 7th, and Israelis became united in supporting one another, because every single Jewish person, at least who I've spoken to, including myself, has been directly impacted by this. So there will be a time to fix and to focus on all of Israel's domestic issues. But right now there's a focus on, focusing on this threat that is affecting all Israelis in the world. And the question of collateral damage is, a very important one. And in an ideal world, there would be a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire on October the 6th, a day before, the attack happened. But, I personally wish that there would be a ceasefire between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors, but it depends who you're talking about, which neighbor. If you're talking about a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, that's not going to work, because Hamas is a terrorist organization that has inflicted one of the most barbaric pogroms in human history, butchering 1,400 Israelis in a matter of hours and taking 240 people hostage, almost all of whom are still held hostage to this day, a month later. Collateral damage is a tragedy, and in an ideal world, which doesn't exist, it wouldn't happen. But unfortunately, especially when you're talking about urban warfare and Israel being attacked and being pulled into this war that it didn't want to be in, there will unfortunately be collateral damage on both sides. It's something that, from what I've seen and learned, Israel is trying to avoid at all costs. But when, as all the mainstream publications have shown, when Hamas is embedding in very densely populated areas, under hospitals, schools, there will unfortunately be collateral damage, and there's not an awful lot that the IDF can do. It can only be so surgical, and it is a tragedy, but war is tragic, and there's not much, unfortunately, that the IDF can do, because it was attacked, 1,400 of its people were slaughtered, and it has to respond in order to protect its people and to reestablish its deterrence, so that something like this will never, ever happen again.
Right. No, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. I will say, from my observation, I'm not trying to push an agenda one way or another, but from my observation of the Hamas leadership, the worst thing that's happened to the Palestinian people is not the Jewish state, it's the Hamas leadership who so callously play with the lives of their people. Again, when I heard them say on Arab TVs that, well, that's just the cost of liberty, while they're safely, in Qatar or enjoying a certain lifestyle. And to be honest, that's dictatorship and autocracies across the Middle East. They have no compassion for their own people. Iran's regime is one, and Hamas leadership is one. They use their people to their own means. And again, looking at history, I'm not trying to take your side or another side. Looking at history, when I saw so many different historical points, milestones where you could have had peace, you could have had a two-state solution, you could have had something except this. So I'm definitely going to question some of my Arab guests when I have them on later with the same questions. Why would with empathy and compassion for the Palestinian people, 100%, and the Jewish people in Israel, why is the Hamas leadership playing this game with the lives of their innocents? Because I can't get myself, ceasefire is 100%, I agree with you. I mean, I would like to see a ceasefire, but I don't know how you tell a community you can't defend yourself. I don't know how we live in the safety as we do in this country, and we can judge other people across the planet, but they have to live there. However, which way you agree with the politics or the settlements, or you don't, or whatever, I have a right to this land, you don't have, all that's historical stuff that people use. People have a right to live in peace. Palestinians and Israelis, period. Unmolested by their leadership and you. So,
and to add to your point, if I may,
of course.
It's not. I don't want to give the impression that there's no appetite for a ceasefire or for peace on the Israeli side. And I'm not speaking on behalf of all Israelis, but you've seen that the Israeli government has said that they will be amenable to ceasefire, as long as the 240 Israelis who are currently still held hostage are released. But it's unfathomable to me to expect a government to want a ceasefire with an organization like Hamas, while 240 of its people, including 9-month-old baby and grandparents, are still being held hostage. It doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Nothing about this makes sense. But Jonathan Harounoff, thank you so much for joining us. Please come back. We'd like to learn more. Unfortunately, this issue will continue for, unfortunately, months to come. The sooner there's peace for both sides, the better. And I really pray and hope that some form of ceasefire will be agreed to, and the hostages will come back soon, and we can work towards reconciling this horrific situation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.